Purposes of a good funeral. And this morning, just want to point out, first of all, the resource, and I mentioned Dr. Wolfelt just a few moments ago. The bulk of my understanding about grief comes from some of the things that he has published through the years, and like I said, having attended some of his lectures. And I'm going to talk about 6 reconciliation needs of mourning in just a few moments this morning. But all this comes from Alan Wolfelt, and much of his materials, many of his resources will reference those 6 reconciliation needs. But I mentioned in particular this book, Creating Meaningful Funeral Ceremonies. It's a guide for caregivers, and so for funeral directors or for ministers. This is a guide that will help in just thinking about creating a meaningful funeral experience. And he also has a book that is similar to this that is called Creating a Meaningful Funeral Ceremony, and it's a guide for families. So families that are planning planning a funeral can use it as a resource for that experience. This book, it's about 20 years old now, and it is still available directly from him on the internet. It's also available on Amazon, and it has a Kindle edition. My copy of the book, and I should have brought it over. Maybe I'll slip over and get it this morning, bring it over. My copy has been so used that it's falling apart. You know, that's how much use it has gotten me through the years. I want to start this morning by talking about the components of the funeral ritual, and I do that because as I talk about each of the purposes this morning, we'll look at 6 reconciliation needs of mourning, and use them to formulate the basis of what we're referring to when we talk about the purposes of a good funeral. And I want to relate each one of those purposes to the key elements or the components of a funeral. And I know this morning that, especially in this first section, that nothing that I say will be new to you if you've ever attended a funeral at all. But real briefly, let's talk about the components of a funeral ritual. First of all, the visitation. And and I want to point out too that that funerals and funeral customs, funeral rituals can differ regionally, geographically. They can differ as much as daylight and dark, and especially when it comes to terminology. What we would generally call the visitation, or most often referred to as the visitation, in some parts of the country is called the wake, or is called receiving of friends, or the calling hours. And in different places, different funeral homes or different regions will speak of this event in those terms, and sometimes use them interchangeably. But generally speaking, this is just a time prior to the funeral where family and friends gather together. Usually the body of the deceased is present in the casket in the funeral home, and people will come to pay their respects to the deceased, and also to offer their sympathy and support for the family. And so it's a pre-funeral gathering. Now, typically and traditionally, in our culture, this was done the day before, or sometimes a couple of days before. Sometimes visitations may take place over the course of a couple of days at the funeral home, or sometimes in people's homes. People would call on the family for up to a couple of days prior to the service, and we're seeing increasingly more in this generation where the visitation immediately precedes the funeral. You may have a visitation for 2 hours, and then the funeral begins right after that. And so everything is all in some cases everything is all in one day, and all within a span of 3 hours maybe. You may have a visitation, a funeral, and a burial and wrapping it all up. And so that's what we're talking about when we use the term visitation. The second component of the funeral ritual is readings. Typically, something is read at the funeral service. Now, this can include the reading of Scripture. It can include the reading of poetry, the reading of the obituary. The idea is that at some point in time during the course of the funeral, something or several things are going to be read. When we refer this morning in this session and in the next session, when we refer to readings, we're using that term collectively to refer to any number of things that may be read. Brother Dennis, one of the things about the funeral, and I want to, now's a good time to say it because I want to reiterate it over and over again. Every funeral ought to be customized to the needs of the family and in some way representative of the person who passed away. So there should never be any such a thing as a cookie cutter funeral. Whatever the need is, let's meet the need, and if the need calls for a lengthier visitation or the need calls for a shorter visitation, then use it. So the visitation, the readings are a core component, and then more often than not, there's music that is involved in a funeral ritual. Generally, certainly in our area, in our culture, that tends to be live music. We've asked somebody from the church, or we've asked a friend or family member to have a song prepared. Sometimes a song is played for a variety of reasons, but most funerals will have at least an element of some music. We'll talk about that a little bit further. Another component of the funeral ritual is the eulogy, or the homily, or the sermon, the message. We're talking about a message that's been prepared generally by the minister, but not necessarily by the minister, but that there's someone who is going to speak, and the purpose of that speech is to communicate in some way or another a life lesson about the deceased, or an attempt to bring some meaning to the person's life, an understanding of who they are. It's not a biography by any case, just like the obituary is not a biography. There's so much more to a person than just simply what can be said over the course of a funeral. But the eulogy is a core component of the funeral ritual, and we'll talk about it very specifically in my last session today. I'll talk about all of these things to some degree, but I want to talk very specifically about the eulogy. Another component of the funeral ritual is the committal, or the graveside service, the burial. That generally follows, immediately following the funeral. In some cases, as we're seeing more and more common, the funeral being at night, which for the most part tends to be about convenience. People that have to work and can't get off work in the middle of the day to attend a funeral that they otherwise would attend. We're seeing a lot more funerals in the evening time, and you can't bury people after dark. It's just not practical, and so in some cases the burial would be the day following the funeral. But there tends to be a short service at the grave site shortly after the funeral, at least right after the funeral or the day after the funeral. In some cases, especially as we're seeing cremation becoming more and more commonplace, even in our area, we're seeing it more and more commonplace. There may not be a committal service at all, or the committal service, if ashes are to be, the remains are to be committed, at the cemetery or the graveside, or spread in a particular place, and there's a ceremony that accompanies that. Sometimes that may take place, several weeks or months. For example, if somebody dies in February, the family may want to spread their ashes somewhere in particular where that it's more conducive to do so in June. And so we're seeing sometimes that the funeral ritual may not really be complete until at a time a lot later down the road. And while we're talking about the subject of cost, a lot of people are going to that route for no other reason except for the costs of burial. And then a last component that I want to mention is the gathering. And typically shortly after the graveside, or maybe even prior to, but typically the family would gather together in a central place and have a meal together. We talk about the gathering typically consists of a meal or a time of fellowship and other things like that. Now, I want to say this morning that too we could get real specific with all these components, and we could add other things to that. I'm going to talk about prayer in my next session. We'll talk about the subject of prayer, and we'll talk about it as a component of the funeral ritual. We could talk about the opening of the funeral, or we could talk about the closing of the funeral, and we could get real specific with each of these portions of the funeral. But these six are the primary things that I want to look at this morning as we talk about the purposes of the funeral. And I want to say again this morning that these six purposes, I'm pulling them from what Dr. Alan Wolfelt refers to as the six reconciliation needs of mourning. The idea is that people who are grieving have needs, and a good funeral will meet those six needs that people who are grieving have in common. So let's look at them. First of all, the first need of mourners and the first purpose of a good funeral is to acknowledge the reality of the death. And now I know that may seem a bit obvious, but it may also not be obvious. Maybe you've known people who have lost somebody. Someone has just died, and it just is. It's not real to them. It hasn't become real to them, or they're in denial. They refuse to accept it, and so acknowledging the reality of the death is the first purpose of the funeral ritual. Reality of death in our minds is acknowledged when we first hear the news. Somebody says, "Hey, such and such has died," and immediately, our mind processes what all of those words mean. The identity of the person who's mentioned, the idea of death itself. These things all come to our mind, and they're in our mind. But that reality transfers to our heart over the process of time. Now, sometimes that transfer from our mind into our heart as we grasp what it really means for that person to be gone takes a little bit of time. And for some people, and in some cases, that reality is short, and for others, someone that's especially close to you, that reality, that may take weeks before that reality really becomes a matter of the heart. The funeral ritual can serve to assist this intellectual to emotional transition. It's during the course of those couple of days that the funeral takes place that we really begin, that we start to make that transition. There's nothing that's more real, for example, than going to the funeral home to make the arrangements, or nothing that's more real than going to the visitation, viewing the body in the casket, or nothing more real than going to the cemetery and so all of these components will help to assist the reality of that death. Now, I want to talk about some things that we can do and some ways in which the components of the funeral ritual help to fulfill that purpose. And first of all, with the visitation, just having a visitation is a big first step. The visitation, first of all, faces people or forces people to face that reality, especially if it's an open casket visitation. Just viewing the body goes a long way to acknowledging that this is real. And we talked about the length of the visitation earlier, and it's not uncommon for some people not to have a visitation at all. It's not uncommon in some places for people not to have a service of any kind. And so they're really taking away the ability, you know, by forfeiting all ceremony, you're taking away that ability for this transition to take place in a way that has meaning. So, you know, having a visitation is a big thing, and then encouraging mourners of all ages to attend is another. And I refer you again to the article that I printed for you about children, and you know, people all the time ask about, you know, children. Alan Wolfelt makes the statement, I've heard him say it several times, that any child that's old enough to love is old enough to mourn. And you know, people ask, well, what age is appropriate for? Well, you know, children are people too, and so encourage all friends. You know, and too many times, not just children but adults will stay away from the visitation. They'll stay away from the funeral itself. They just can't. You know. They can't wrap their mind around. I know too many people, you know, in their early 20s who, and even older, that have never attended a funeral. They just avoid, you know, their own funeral, maybe the only one that they ever go to. They're doing everything they can to avoid it, and don't want to face maybe their own mortality, or just can't deal with that loss. And so helping people work through that loss is a key function, I believe, of our job as clergy. And the readings, I just want to say that when we're choosing readings, whether it's a passage of scripture, or maybe that we will read, or that we will quote, or a particular piece of poetry, you know, choosing readings that specifically mention death will help people to acknowledge the reality of the death. So choose those readings. Why? That doesn't mean that every reading has to be morbid. You know, you can fail, or has to be dark and foreboding. But just confronting the reality of death will make a big difference. In the music that we choose, you know, sometimes quiet reflection during a song prompts this acknowledgement. As people are. Whether it's the music that is played prior to, or maybe some music during the visitation, you know, or music during the service itself. Sometimes just the music playing. You know, music has a capacity to do something to us emotionally, and so we're transferring that knowledge from the mind into the heart. Choosing a song, you know, a known favorite of the deceased sometimes, for, you know, especially if it's a song that the people who are, you know, the principal mourners, they know. You don't even have to tell them that song has meaning. You know, for some, you know, for others, you may have to point it out. You know, a few years ago when I preached the funeral of one of our former general overseers, Brother C.B. Ellis had labored and preached and sang for years, and he had a song that was his song that, you know, anybody that ever heard C.B. Ellis sing knew that, you know, Inside the Gates was his song. I mean, and so at his funeral, when we sang that song, I didn't have to say. Now, this was C.B. Ellis's song. You know, everybody that showed up at the funeral that knew him well enough to even come to the funeral knew that was his song, and so much so that some of his kids told me during the course of the visitation, or maybe shortly after the funeral, I think one of the kids at least mentioned to me that their first words were "Inside the Gates." You know, Dad had sang that song in revivals, you know, camp meetings, the tent meetings and stuff for so many years during our formal. They grew up learning the words to that song, and so immediately, you know, just hearing the words to that song causes someone to face that reality. Several years ago, I did a funeral for a young girl that died with a brain tumor, a cancerous tumor on a brainstem, and that family played a song after the service was over, as the casket was being closed, and to close the service out, they played a song. And so, you know, when you play a song, that's different than when you sing a song. People sing, you know, you can sing the same song over and over again. You're never going to sing it exactly the same way. Your voice is, you know, different today than it was yesterday, or this, that, and the other. But when you play a song that's been recorded, it sounds exactly the same every time that you hear it. And still to this day, every time, you know, if I'm in the store somewhere and there's a radio on and that song comes on, as soon as that introduction starts, I'm taken back to that funeral home, to that chapel at the close of that. So there's something powerful about music. It does that to me. It's been 16 years, I guess, since that funeral. And if that introduction starts right now, then immediately, emotionally, I'm taken right back to that place. So music has a powerful capacity to cause us to face that reality. During the course of the eulogy, acknowledging the reality of death can be done by frequently mentioning the person by name. Talking about the person who has died. Now, I hate to sound this morning. I hate to sound obvious. You know, thank you, Captain Obvious. I'm going to tell you something. I'm amazed at how many funerals that I go to where during the course of the eulogy, the person who has died is rarely, if ever, mentioned. I mean, I've been to funerals where the person who died was never really even mentioned, and almost never mentioned. I went to one in particular that comes to my mind where a little boy had died, where 35 minutes into the message, which was way past time for the message, but 35 minutes into the message, his name was mentioned for the first time. And I thought, you know, what we've been doing here all this time. So frequently mentioning the person by name goes a long way to helping face that reality. And if appropriate, revisiting the circumstances of the death can help us to face that reality. Just acknowledging the manner in which that they died. During the committal service, now obviously just being at the cemetery, you know, an open grave, a tombstone, or surrounded by other grave markers goes a long way to accomplishing this purpose. People know why they're there. And I want to say also, individuals find meaning in a variety of ways. You know, it is in some places there is a tradition of staying at the cemetery, you know, until the body is lowered. And some families find meaning, find comfort, or find help, especially in this particular purpose, in acknowledging the reality of death by watching the body lowered into the grave. Others, it's not uncommon for folks to want to throw a handful of dirt on the grave. They find, to help them acknowledge this reality, they find comfort and meaning in that. And so, you know, be respectful of. You say, well, that's not for me. I want to get out of there as quick as I can. You know, some people won't even go to the cemetery. They don't want to face that reality. And others will go later. They'll go after the grave's been covered, or some will wait until the grass is growing, or whatever the case is. But people will find help in a variety of ways for meeting this need. Then at the gathering, a meaningful funeral will have fully dosed mourners by this with this reality by the time they get to the dinner. And so you may not need to do anything at all when you get together with the family at the dinner to help meet this need. It's probably already been met. A second purpose of a good funeral is to move toward the pain of the loss. Now, I know our culture probably teaches us to avoid pain at all costs. We tend to run from it. But healthy grief requires the expression of painful thoughts and feelings to get close to embrace that discomfort. Funerals provide an accepted venue for mourners to express their pain. You know, our culture is such that, you know, we communicate to people that their grief or their expressions of grief is not welcome in our presence. When people talk about someone who has died or what have you, on the job or this and that and the other, we communicate a lot of times just from our body language and this and that and the other. We communicate to people that we're not really, you know, comfortable with that, or we don't want to. I mean, think about it. What is our natural reaction when people are crying? When someone's crying in our presence, our natural reaction, we find a tissue and we hand it to them. What we're doing without really even realizing that we're doing it, we're communicating to them that please don't cry in my presence. You know what I mean? Our body language is suggesting that. But the funeral, the funeral is a place. You'll find people, and our culture has taught us this, because you can be talking to somebody in Walmart that has just lost somebody, and they'll tears will well up in their eyes, and then they'll apologize. They'll break down and cry, and they'll apologize to you for that's not an acceptable place. Well, the funeral home is an acceptable place, and the funeral experience is an acceptable place. You're allowed to cry at the funeral home, and so we're having a funeral is providing people with an acceptable place to express their pain. At the visitation, viewing the body can be both painful and helpful in that regard. As a minister, a lot of times, you may be asked to accompany the family for that initial viewing. Sometimes they'll ask. I generally ask when I'm doing a funeral and the family's giving me the arrangements, let me know, well, we're going to have a visitation. It's going to be from 6 to 8 or what have you. And sometimes the family will say, the visitation from 6 to 8, the family's going to be there at 5. When a family tells me that the family's going to be there prior to the public visitation, I use that sometimes as a door to ask the next question, what time would you like me to be there? Sometimes what they're doing is very subtly, without trying to impose on you, they're very subtly suggesting to you, or that maybe they'd like for you to be there. Sometimes people want to face that by themselves, and they'll say, well, no, it's 6 o'clock. The visitation starts at 6. The family's going to be there. That would be. And I've found myself, what time would you like for me to be? Because I don't mind at all to be. Sometimes I've had church members that want to hold on to my arm, when the first time they go to the casket, and others are comfortable leaning on other family and friends or doing it alone. And so be open to the needs of the people that you're serving. The readings that you choose readings that encourage mourners to embrace the pain, not just feel good readings. There's plenty of scriptures where the psalmist David, for example, embraces his pain. He's got all kinds of questions that he's wrestling with, and people need to know that it's okay to hurt. Now we're obviously going to offer hope. We're going to offer comfort that is available through the power of the Holy Spirit. The Word of God is filled with plenty of words that uplift, but don't minimize people's pain by only focusing on feel-good passages. One man said, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. I thought that was a worthwhile quote for us to consider. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Music that you choose. Choose music that helps people embrace their sadness. I talked earlier about the emotional needs and the emotional power that is involved in music. During the course of the eulogy, acknowledge the pain that mourners are feeling. Don't be afraid to communicate to people not only that you know that they're hurting, but that it's okay to hurt. I had a text message one night this week asking me to pray for a friend who had lost her dad unexpectedly, and this friend has been talking to the daughter that lost her father, and she's communicated to her that I'm having to be strong for everybody else, having to be strong for Mom, and you're the only one that I don't feel like I have to be strong in front of. And I told the mutual friend that I was talking to, I said, make sure that you communicate to her that she has permission to be just as weak as she wants to be. When you're a daddy's girl, you're an only child, and you lose your dad, you have the right to be just as weak as you want to be. So communicate to people during the course of that eulogy that not only is it normal that it's perfectly acceptable to be, because for one thing, as we're trying to communicate to people to look to Christ for strength, you don't need strength if you're not weak. Part of helping people get to the place where they can receive comfort is getting them to move toward the pain that they feel. Blessed are they that do mourn, for they shall be comforted. The only way to get comfort is to mourn. And that's what Jesus taught. And so moving toward that pain goes a great deal toward meeting that key. And then I want to just mention too, even our eternal hope does not take away our need to mourn. We are Christians. We sorrow not as others who have no hope. But Paul did not say that we don't sorrow, that we don't grieve, that it doesn't hurt when we lose somebody that we love. And you can console yourself and thank God that we do have the comfort that those who know the Lord are with the Lord, our loved ones who have died in Christ, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord, and they are released from the pain and the suffering and the toil that they've encountered here in this world. But that knowledge that they are with the Lord and that for eternity they're comforted and that someday we will join them, it only goes so far into relieving the present emptiness that we feel in their loss. And so acknowledge the pain in that moment. And then thirdly on that subject, if it's appropriate, model your own grief. As the minister, if it's someone that was close, especially close to you, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to model that grief also. You can communicate to people that you're ministering to that it's okay to cry if you communicate that by shedding your own tears. What did Jesus, what is that Bible verse that all of us learned so well when we were children? Jesus did exactly that. He was communicating to Martha and Mary that it was perfectly acceptable to cry. I loved him too. We do the same thing when we weep. At the committal, mourners will naturally confront their pain during the burial. You may not have to do anything or say anything to help them move toward that. And again, at the gathering, no conscious pain invoking is necessary at this point. The third purpose of a good funeral is to remember the person who died. For grief to heal, we must shift our relationship with the person who died from one of physical presence to one of memory. In order for us to find healing, they're no longer with us, but they'll always be with us in memory. Our memories are very, and the truth is, when you've lost somebody that's close to you, the longer you live without them, the more precious that those memories become, more precious that they really are. We bring them back to life when we reminisce. We recall those stories. A meaningful funeral facilitates that shift from actively present or physically present with us to memory. Let's talk about the ways that's accomplished at the visit. Because of the loose structure of the visitation, mourners often gather in groups and share stories. It's perfectly natural at the a good funeral visitation is one that's not quiet. I like being in a funeral visitation where people are talking and gathering up in groups, and a good funeral visitation, not only will people be talking, but they'll also be laughing. They'll be sharing stuff, and in some cases they'll be crying and laughing at the same time. So the visitation goes a long way to accomplishing that, and we do it through pictures with memory boards or what have you, DVDs that are becoming more and more common to show during the course of the funeral visitation. And then another way we can do this is to encourage mourners to write memories. Sometimes the visitation book itself, or will have either in the book or next to it, will have something for people to write down and share their stories. This can be not only a valuable thing for the person who writes it down, but also for the people who later on are going to look through these things, for the family, as you know, down the road a month from now or a year from now or whenever, they can go back to those, and it's like withdrawing. They're withdrawing from that treasure that's been deposited by others, recalling the stories and the various ways that the person that they love, the relationships and the meaning of those. Select scripture readings or other readings that capture the life and the beliefs of the person who died. We're remembering them by finding a poem or finding a passage of scripture that really speaks to who that person was. You know, a good funeral, a minister will choose a text that in some way or another embodies. You know, I want people during the course of my ministry, anytime that I ever preach a sermon where I quote Hebrews, where the apostle said about Abel that he being dead yet speaketh. I want people who were at Devin Smith's funeral to remember, oh yeah, that was the funeral text. Because of the way that I said that verse described gave meaning to his life. So we're selecting scripture. We're choosing a piece to read that really speaks or captures to help facilitate that memory. And if necessary, preface the readings with their significance. I'm reading today, you know, this particular poem, or I'm reading this particular passage, or this, you know, if it's then draw the significance and connect it. In the music, choose songs that represent or were meaningful to the person who died. And you know, I mentioned earlier the song at Brother Ellis's funeral. If you have to communicate it, then communicate it. Sometimes you don't even have to. Everybody knows it. But share the significance. During the course of the eulogy, incorporate as many anecdotes from as many different individuals as possible. You know, share as many stories from as many different people as possible. You know, nobody is one-dimensional. You know, and our relationships with the people that we come into contact with really, you know, define who we are, make us who we are. You know, I am not just a husband. I'm not just a pastor. I'm not just a father. I am not just an Angels fan. I am not just, you know, a history lecturer at the community college. I'm not just, you know, I am all these things. And so pulling together, you know, pulling together stories from, you know, I think about my friend Wally, who died in a car wreck about 14 years ago, and think about his funeral in particular. There's an episode of Seinfeld that Wally and I used to talk about quite frequently when it comes to his life. You know, Wally was one of those guys that in that episode, Seinfeld kind of spoke to it. It's an episode where George has got engaged, and you know, and Elaine is wanting to spend some time with George's fiance, wanting to, you know, get, and George just can't even conceive it. I mean, he's going crazy just thinking about it. No, he cannot have Elaine running around with his fiance. Those are two different parts of his life. And he points out to Jerry. He says, you know, if there's relationship George and there's independent George. And he said, you know, if Elaine starts hanging out with her, then that's going to bring relationship George into our circle. And you know, he said if relationship George comes through that door, he will kill independent George. And so he's talking about keeping his world separate. And I would joke with Wally oftentimes, because he was heavily involved with the Young Republicans up there in northern Ohio, and a year or so before he died, he got a job at Jacobs Field and was working as an usher there at the ballpark. And then of course he had family that a lot of his church friends from church camp, and then church got him out in assembly that never met his family prior to the you know, most of his friends at church camp, dear friends, had never met any of his family, and so he had all these different areas of his life. And at his funeral, it was I mentioned somebody. It was kind of like, you know, it's kind of like putting together a puzzle where everybody was bringing a different piece to get an idea. And I thought a lot about that since then. really that's kind of what every funeral is like. We don't fully know anybody. But it's the relationships that we have. So pull as many stories from as many different people as you can, and bring them, to paint a picture or to tell a story of that individual. If sometimes you may ask someone to share some memories. Some people are not comfortable getting up in front of other. We tend to, in the ministry, take it for granted because we do it on a regular basis. Everybody's not capable of standing up and especially to share, privacy. But they may, somebody may be willing to do it, or they may be willing to write some stories down or share some stories with you. But remember the person who died. Again, I've been to too many funerals where the person who has died is not even talked about. It's not even mentioned. And I went to a funeral about a year ago. One of our church members' father had died out in western Kentucky, and I went out to that funeral, and he had recently given his heart to the Lord. He'd been sick for about a year or so, and he just had given his heart to the Lord. And neither one of the preachers knew him terribly well. They both had met him, but neither one of them knew him very well. Both of them prefaced their remarks with, "I didn't know Al, very, very well." Well, they really didn't have to preface their remarks with that, because what they said gave evidence to the fact that they didn't talk about him at all. And so, we left the funeral with it being terribly, terribly impersonal, with really no memories of the person who died. A good funeral will have you leaving there feeling like you can go to a funeral for somebody you never met. And if the man doing the eulogy does you can leave there not only feeling like you know him, but leave there with your own sense of loss, but hating that you never got to know him. A good eulogy will do that in people's lives. At the committal, select a final reading that characterizes the person who died, or share a final anecdote from his or her life. And then at the gathering, sometimes people designate a memory table. Again, where more pictures are displayed, and encourage the sharing of stories among family members and close friends. Keep people talking. They know why they're there, and continue to remember that person. The fourth purpose is to develop a new self-identity. Social beings find meaning in life by the relationships they forge with those that are around them. I mentioned that my multifaceted, life. Who I am is largely defined by who I am to those that I love. And so when somebody dies, when we lose someone who helps us define us, we lose a part of us. How many times have you heard somebody who has lost someone that they love say, "I feel like a part of me died. I feel like I've lost a part of me." The funeral serves as a rite of passage that helps us redefine who the mourners are. You think about all the rites of passage that are in our life. From the time that we're born until the time that we die. There are different stages of our life, or different times of our, that help to define us. The first day of school, for example. We're a student. We take pictures of it. We celebrate it. We put it nowadays. We post them all over social media. It is a celebration because it has a lot. It says a whole lot about our identity. The same thing is true about our spiritual life at our baptism. Now, or for some people it's the first communion or the confirmation or what have you. In some group it's water baptism or church membership. It's a rite of passage that helps define who we are. I'm a Christian. I'm a child of God. I'm a member of the body of Christ. I'm a member of the church. When we graduate from high school, it's a rite of passage that defines who we are. It's a time of celebration. There's a ceremony that's involved, and we are no longer the student. We're now, or the college graduate. The same thing will take place again at a different time in our life. At retirement, when people retire, there's sometimes a ceremony. I'm no longer in the active, and people struggle at each of these places. They struggle with that new identity. You ever met somebody that worked for 40 days and never took a day off work, and then all of a sudden now they got to retire and they have no idea what to do with themselves. They don't know who they are anymore. because all their life has been their identity has been forged by being the foreman or by being this or that and the other. Same thing is true with marriage, the ceremony of marriage. Marriage redefines who we are. You don't even know who, I don't even remember who I used to be anymore. And too many times, people who have been married for a long, long time, their identities get so connected with one another that to be separate. The last funeral that I did was for a member of our church, been a member of our church for over 60 years. Not only was she a member of our church for over 60 years, she was a wife for nearly 60 years. And if you don't think that husband's identity has changed for all those, and I'm talking about to the place where when people come to people who don't know the family extremely well, the church folks, that know that couple, that know how they've labored in the church, when they see family members, they don't know whether that was his brother, sister, or that was her brother, sister. They know their family. They don't know which part of the family they're connected to. And the truth is, inside that family dynamic, it doesn't matter. His brothers and sisters and her brothers and sisters function together as one family during that event, because for 60 years, that's the way they've operated. They've come together over and over and over again. And so when we have a funeral, a lot of times we're helping people come to terms with to facilitate that purpose of who I am in their life. That visitation is an initial dose of self-identity change. Mourners come together in a social situation for the first time at the visitation. Have you ever run into somebody that you knew that somebody had died in their life? You run into them, you didn't get to go to the visitation of the funeral, and you see them again for the first time. That first occasion when you run into that person, for me anyway, that's a terribly awkward thing. I have to acknowledge the loss. That's the first time I've come to, I find myself, trying to piece together my relationship with them, absent of that one that, especially if I knew the person who had died also, or what. But that visitation facilitates that shift. It takes that awkwardness. Next time I see, if you go to the visitation and the funeral, then you see them out in town. That's a different dynamic than it is when you see them for the very first time out in a public setting. So that visitation will help us in forging those relationships. You may consider asking mourners to read a selected piece. It may be somebody has that. Maybe they have that ability or that willpower to help to define that. Somebody may want to write something. As a child, for example, as I face the future without my dad. As we're looking at the first time without. Some people may find some meaning as they've helped to start to think about life without that person that they've loved. Maybe mourners can consider their own unique relationships with the person who died and how their lives will change. It may be that a song in particular has a particular capacity to help people confront that. And you may just ask folks, now as they sing this next song, let us start thinking about. Let us start thinking about the future. In the eulogy, speak directly to those whose self-identities will be most affected by the death. Be specific and deal directly with those who in some way. And I'm not talking about preaching an entire sermon to one individual, but certainly acknowledge those who are directly affected by that loss. They now acknowledge their struggle to redefine themselves. Especially, let me say too, especially speaking to those who may not be the first ones you think about. Sometimes there's forgotten mourners. That have a new struggle. I mentioned my friend Wally. Wally died just 2 days after he had proposed marriage the girl that he had been talking to. I say it like that because most of us who knew him, good friends, didn't even know he was in a relationship, much less had the time to find out that he was engaged. And so, sometimes there are people who are connected, there are people who have relationships that, they're not listed in the obituary, because of the, you may mention a special friend or this and that, but there's sometimes there are people who are grieving, who are mourning, that used to be related by marriage or this and that. We're living in a dynamic anymore where obituaries are going to get harder and harder they're going to get harder and harder to read, they're going to get harder and harder to process. I read one a few years ago where I'm telling you the truth. It was 2 or 3 days after the funeral before I had time to process exactly how people were related. I had to go back and read the obituary several times and then write out my own diagrams to piece together that particular family dynamic. I mean, that's a reality that we are facing, and so acknowledging people's pain is good. And listen, whether we, as conservative as we are, whether we want to admit it or not, we're dealing in a culture where there are going to be people who have a romantic interest in the person who died that is not the kind of relationship that is appropriate in the Scripture, and we preach against and this and that and the other. But if we're going to effectively comfort people and minister to people and have any hope of pointing them to Christ, who can help them in all the other areas of their life, we're going to have to acknowledge the pain whether we want to or not. And so it's getting more and more difficult to minister to people in this culture, and part of that is because of all these relationships that we find ourselves in. And during the course of the committal service, this is often self-apparent as mourners walk away from the burial spot. They'll walk away, who am I now? At the gathering, by encouraging families to have a gathering and attend that gathering, you're helping them work on this need. Sometimes families are gathering together for the first time without, in a social setting, in a dinner setting, without that person present. Don't make that first time Christmas. Don't be too many times we have we only have family reunions once a year if we have them at all. That gathering serves as that initial. And it's going to be those family reunions are never going to be the same, and Christmas is never going to be the same. And so every time that we confront that reality, we're helping ourselves in that healing process. Fifth, and I'm going to try to wrap this up real quickly this morning. The fifth purpose is searching for meaning. When someone we love dies, we naturally question the meaning of life and death. To heal, we must explore the questions we encounter in that process. People are going to ask why. And too many times, we hear cliches like, don't ask God, or don't question God. We're quick to give them, or we're quick to allow other people to give them. You can't question God. Well, I've said for years, if you can't bring your questions to the one that has all the answers, where can you take them? I'm not talking about blaming God or pointing the finger, but sometimes why is a legitimate question. And we may never be satisfied with the answer we get from God if we get an answer at all. But there's certainly something very natural about asking that question. We're looking for meaning in all of life's circumstances. On a more fundamental level, the funeral reinforces one central fact of our existence: we will die. Thus, the funeral helps us search for meaning in the life and the death of the person who died, as well as in our own lives and in impending deaths. So we're not just helping folks to come to terms with the meaning of this person's life and death, but really with their own life. It's a much bigger picture than that. Their own life and death that comes into play. At the visitation, encourage family members to spend time with the body as they explore meaning of life questions. In the course of the readings, meaningful readings are one of the most important vehicles to accomplish this goal. We want meanings that are readings that force us to think about to think about this subject. Complement Scripture with other appropriate readings. You may encounter a wide variety of quotations or poems or what have you that help. And I would suggest stockpiling a good. Find yourself a good folder and keep poems in that you may refer to often, or save them on your hard drive, or you can copy and paste into your notes. If you find a good reading that speaks to that need, then don't be afraid to reuse them. Music has a powerful capacity to bring meaning to a mourner's belief system. Choose songs that mean something. In our worship services, I want songs that mean something. And do the same thing in a funeral service. During the course of the eulogy, acknowledge the mourner's search for meaning. I don't know how many times I've said in a funeral, I know a lot of you have come asking why. That may not be the thing that you propose at every single funeral, but some funerals more than others, some deaths more than others. Because of the circumstances, we're asking. This week I attended the funeral of a 3-year-old boy down at the funeral home. There's a lot of people there that had questions. There are a lot of people that went there searching for meaning. They're asking why. Why would God allow? So I've never been and don't ever want to be comfortable in a world where there's such a thing as a child-sized casket. And it's unnatural. I don't ever want to get comfortable with comments about the meaning of this life and this death in the context of the family's faith. Meet them at the place where they are. The only way we're going to ever find meaning is in, especially in the meaning of life, is in the one who gives life. And so, as we're searching for, as people are searching for meaning, as they have questions. Tell them it's perfectly natural to ask questions, but point them in the direction of the one that has the answer. And that's not me. I don't know how many times I've said I don't have the answer. It ain't in me. But I know the one that does. At the committal, this is the last opportunity to relate the death to a context of meaning. These words at the committal may be the words. It's the last words we get to speak on the subject, and it may be the words that are best remembered. So let's early on in my early ministry, I tended to think about funerals, or tended to think about the committal service on my way to the cemetery. I've had to go back and really reconsider. I've had to really, as God has helped me to hone my skills and really think about the impact that I want to make in people's lives. It may be that at the cemetery, those words are the words that people are going to hold on to. So make sure you choose them very wisely. And listen, at the cemetery, you got a lot fewer words than you did in the funeral home. So using wisdom and speaking words of wisdom really is the challenge. At the gathering, people will often talk in small groups about their personal theories of life and death. This is healthy. Just don't allow those unhealthy platitudes. You know what I'm talking about by unhealthy, those platitudes that we hear all too often during the course of a funeral. People say, well, this was God's way, or this was God's will, or, especially in the cases where, you've got a 3-year-old laying in a casket, and you're all the time having people will come and say that, well, you've got an angel in heaven now. And granted, I don't have time to correct people's theology. I'm not really sure that, I don't believe we become angels. Angels are created beings or serve a different purpose. We don't, we're not going to correct people's theology. But honestly, even if that were the case, there's no value in that. People are not concerned about having angels in heaven when they had an angel here on earth that was really what they were wanting and what they, would rather. I'd much rather have. We will find comfort in the knowledge that our small children are with the Lord when we get there. In the meantime, we have to have comfort in other ways, and so we're constantly bombarded with people will say things like because we couch them in religious terms too. I mean, we'll tell people, well, God won't lay any more on us than we're able to bear, and people are really questioning God's judgment upon it. Well, yeah, He said He wouldn't, but I really don't feel like I'm near as strong as God thinks I am. And people are dealing with these are real issues. And then the last thing is receive ongoing support from others. Funerals are the public venue for offering support to others and being supported in grief. Generally speaking, in our culture, if somebody in your family dies, work may give you 3 days off, and then we expect you to be back at work and pretend like, you ought to be through, it ought to be over by now. You should be right back where you, but funerals are that public venue where people are allowed to grieve and to mourn and to have others with them. Funerals allow us to physically demonstrate our support by being there. And also, there are people that there are people that you are familiar with, that you are acquainted with. If you run into them at Walmart now, I'm not talking about Pastor Grubbs, because I know if Bobby Grubbs runs into you wherever you're at, he's going to hug you. He's going to do it, and that's the way he is. And I don't mind that at all. I appreciate that. There's some cases where you may know somebody, you may hardly know them, whatever. You're not going to run up and put your arms around them and this, that. But a funeral is a place where it is always appropriate to physically touch someone and communicate to them. Hey, just putting your hand on somebody's shoulder, giving somebody a hug, let them know I'm sorry, I'm here for you. Communicates a great deal of support without even saying a word. And so funerals allow us that opportunity to do that. Funerals also establish helping relationships for the principal mourners. We put ourselves in a position to be of help and to receive support. People will come to a funeral and they'll ask, what can I do? What can I? And that's what we need to ask, and that's really the way we need to ask the question. Stop asking if you need anything, call me. How many times have we said that? How many times have we ever been called? How many times have you been told that? How many times have you ever made the call? We're not that way. We're not going to call and say, hey, you said if I ever needed anything and I need my driveway shoveled out, can you come and, we're not going to do that. But ask, what can I do? What can I take care of? What can I, during this time, there are practical needs that still need to be met. And so do what we can to meet those needs, find the need and meet them. Educate the family about the supportive messages conveyed by sending flowers and bringing food. When words are inadequate, there are gestures that we can make, there are things that we can do to help people, that communicate to people, hey, you matter. It was worth my time, it was worth my effort. And model your support by attending the visitation. Be there. Typically, when I'm asked to do a funeral, I typically arrive at least at the beginning of the visitation and stay to the close of the visitation. Now, if I generally ascertain from the family what time they want me there, if the family's coming early and they would like for me to be there early, I generally come that early time and then stay. I typically, now everybody's time frame may not, but I make that a priority to be there at the visitation. There's a lot of people that you're going to get the chance to meet during the course of that couple hours or that few hours. You're going to try to minister to, make sure you meet all the family members. There's extended family and friends. People want to introduce you as a pastor or what have you. You can't minister to people in your absence. You can only minister to them if you're present, and so being there sometimes depending on the particular dynamic of that family, There are times that I am there and active and in the front and standing at the casket and this and that and the other. And then there's times that I'm sitting in a pew, just kind of, doing. I've done funerals on a number of occasions for families that I didn't know at all, and so didn't know people that come in. Everybody that came into the visitation was a total stranger to me. Taking time to get to know them goes a long way to not only ministering to them in that moment, but then down the road also. Especially if you're going to pastor a church in the same community for any length of time. If your intention is to stay in that community, and minister in that community, then getting to know as many people in that community and making sure they know who you are is when they recognize you in Walmart. Is going to make a big difference on the impact of your ministry. When you're using readings, sometimes a responsive reading that encourages other voices to participate facilitates in that support. I like one of the things that Bill's brother-in-law, I've seen William Boyd on numerous occasions pray together, do the Lord's Prayer together, and invite the participants to pray along with it. Those that have been raised in church and what have you, they're familiar with the Lord's Prayer, know it well enough. There's just something about doing things together that communicates, that I'm not alone, and that hearing other people's voices along with your own communicates whether you say anything about it or not. It communicates I'm not alone. I'm not in this thing by myself. There are other people that are here. And during the course of the music, and the same thing may be accomplished with the music. I'm not saying every song ought to be a sing-along, but it may be that, as you encourage others to, maybe in one song in particular, utilize it as a song where you invite the congregation to, especially if it's a hymn, something that's known by many of them, invite others to sing along. Asking, and another possibility is asking mourners to join hands. Oftentimes during prayer, especially during at least one prayer, I'll ask the mourner to take somebody by the hand and communicate that support. I'm not in this thing. I'm not carrying this burden by myself. And it may be that during a song you may say, as they sing this, as they sing "Beulah Land," won't you just reach over and take somebody by the hand and just consider there's going to be a time where we. Right now we're saying goodbye and we're letting go, but there's going to be a time where we're going to be all gathered together in a land with one another. At the eulogy, tell those in attendance that their presence speaks to the bereaved family at a time when words are inadequate. Just your being there has a capacity to speak support. And at times I've told families, especially during times when I expect cliches to be thrown and these unhealthy platitudes to be thrown. I've told families prior to the visitation, I said, remember, everybody that comes to this visitation day is coming because they love you and because they support you and because they're here. So take comfort from their presence, but don't listen to anything that they say. Because I've told because sometimes, and there have been plenty of times I don't have words. I showed up one time at a person's home shortly after their ex-husband had committed suicide, and he had called his ex-wife. He'd been trying to reconcile with her. He wanted to get back together, and he called her on the phone and said, "I'm going to kill myself," and she heard the gun shot go off. And she told him, "This is exactly where they're going to find my body," and this and that. And he was exactly where they told him he would be. I went over to that home as soon as I got the call, found out about it. I went over to that home. I'd married that couple several years before that, and I went over to that home, and she had some friends that were there, and I was in that home for about 45 minutes before I ever said a word. And part of that was because I didn't have any idea what to say. Somebody commented, one of the friends that was there, that was talking to her and trying to console with it, had mentioned, I learned a lot about this kind of stuff just from you being there not saying a word. You know, that we communicate, our presence communicates so very much. When my mom's brother died about 4 years ago this spring, and I went up to visit. I went up to visit him in the hospital just a couple of weeks before he died, and my cousin, his son, was there in the hospital room, and I've been here for 23 years out of Indiana, but Eric never did live in Indiana. He was born in Colorado, has lived in Colorado all of his life, and I saw him as a kid. He's 4 or 5 years younger than me. I saw him as a kid. You know, maybe once during the summer, about 6 or 8 times growing up. I hadn't seen him. We connected on Facebook a few years back, but I hadn't seen him, hadn't been in the same room with him in at least 30 years. And he sent me a message. He asked me, you know, my grandmother had asked me, and he asked me to participate in the funeral. I sang a couple songs at his funeral. But Eric sent me a message after the funeral was over on Facebook, and he said something to me about my being there at the funeral, and about being there in the room to visit his dad the week before he died. And he made a comment, you know, and I don't remember having said anything. Certainly didn't say anything profound. I don't remember saying anything at all. But it didn't say anything at all. But Eric sent me a message, and he said your presence had a calming influence. Those were the words that he used, and I've not forgotten them. And I want you ministers to know, your presence has the capacity to remind people, you know, you're a man of God, you're a representative of God. You're reminding people that the Lord has not left them in this moment. And so your eulogy, it ought to communicate that. You're communicating to other people that their presence is a reminder that nobody has to go through this thing alone. So encourage those mourners to lean on others. Don't be afraid to lean on. These people are here to support you. Let them do that. Then verbally invite everyone, you know, at the committal service, verbally invite everyone to attend the gathering. You know, as you're dismissing from the committal service, tell them, hey, there's dinner at the church. You know, the church has been cooking. We've got, you know, things back at the fellowship hall. Everybody come and emphasize that value of ongoing support. Communicate to people, you know, you have needed each other these last few days. You're going to need each other even more so in the days to come. And then, you know, the gathering is a natural time for fellowship. So communicate to the family. While you're there, communicate to them that you will be contacting them again soon. Before you leave, let them know, hey, I'm going, and then follow through with it. And I'll say more about that. And let me wrap this up this morning by just let me talk about a few misconceptions. I mean, I mentioned these 6 that come from the 6 reconciliation needs of mourning. But let me just talk about what the purposes of a funeral are not. Real quickly. The funeral is not to give a family closure. You know, too many times we hear that word used, you know, the family needs closure. I hate that word. You know, the word, it means closing. And you know, if you've ever lost somebody that you love, you know that the funeral doesn't close anything. You know, the cemetery, the trip to the cemetery doesn't close anything. There's still a whole lot of wounds that are open. There's a lot of things that are, you know, and so you're not, and too many times ministers have that mentality that when the funeral's over, my job is done. Well, no, not if you're going to effectively minister to these people who are grieving, because it doesn't matter what you say at that funeral, you're not going to take all their pains away, and nobody's going to shake you on the hand and shake your hand when they're leaving the cemetery and say, preacher, I don't hurt anymore. You did a good job. You know, it's not going to happen. So the funeral's not going to serve that function. So get that out of your mind. The second thing, the funeral is not to honor the last wishes of the deceased. You know, the funeral exists primarily for the support of those who are living. And I'm not talking about disrespecting the wishes of the deceased in any way, shape, or form, but keep in mind that the funeral is about ministering to those people that the deceased has left behind. I think we ought to do all that we can to accommodate the wishes of the deceased if it's possible. But the needs of the hurting people are real, and that's one of the things that you might communicate to the family. A lot of times the deceased may not have wanted any funeral at all. They didn't want, they didn't want this or they didn't want that, and the family finds themselves in a position where we feel like we need to have a service. You need to communicate to the family. Well, you got to do what you got to do to meet your need. You can't. You can't do, and so communicate to the family that we're here to minister to your needs. A third thing, funeral is not to determine or prove a person's eternal destination. Too many times we go to a funeral where you feel like the minister is trying to justify, or to prove, why I know they're in heaven, and here's the list of reasons why. And sometimes if it's a saint, it can be celebratory. Or sometimes if it's a person who, maybe, the truth of the matter is we don't know. I think if somebody leaves us with hope, we ought to offer the family hope. And I'm not talking about creating false hope. But if there's, and sometimes families don't, if somebody leaves and they leave the world without a strong testimony, it may be that, the family's holding on to a glimmer of hope, and we ought to do all we can to facilitate that and hold on to that and say, listen, they were raised right, they know right from wrong, they had time to pray, before they died. And then, there's all kinds of ways you can communicate. But the funeral doesn't serve, for us to pass judgment on the person who has died and say, well, I know they're here, right? Or in any way, shape, or form. Now listen, I mentioned earlier, it is very comforting to think that the person that we love is going on to be with the Lord. That they're not in pain, they're not suffering. That is comforting, but that is only part of the comfort. When you love somebody that that you've lost, when you've buried a spouse, or you've said goodbye to a mom or dad, or you've buried a child or what have you, yes, thank God that they're with the Lord and we'll see them again. There's comfort in that, but that's not. If that's all the hope or all the comfort that we give, then we're good, solid Christians that have loved God for many years grieve and mourn the loss of their loved ones, despite the fact that they know they're with the Lord. And an empty house, heaven's full of my friends, but that empty house is communicating on a regular basis to me that I'm hurting, and so that's another. And then the last thing I want to say is the funeral is not a time to evangelize the lost. Now my intention this morning was to, and I've got a partial article written. My intention this morning was to have in your folder an article where I'm working on this, and hopefully we'll distribute it to you. We'll pass it on. We'll pass it on to you, where I spell out all the reasons why I do not believe that the funeral is the time to evangelize the lost. Now I will say this: the only hope that people have of comfort is in the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the only hope that we have of people being comforted. And those that are lost will never know the full potential of the comfort that is available in Christ until they look to Him. And our job is to point people to that source of comfort. And if they find that source of comfort in Christ, they will. Then I believe they'll pursue a relationship with Him when they realize He can comfort me not only in this present situation, but then in all the other areas of my life as well. Now, there's so many reasons, and I'm not going to take time to get into all of them this morning. There's so many reasons why I feel like this and feel this strongly. But let me just say this: if we're not careful, we will tend to think about people's ultimate need. Our ultimate need is salvation. We will tend to think about people's ultimate need to the point where we lose sight of their pressing need. The need right now, their most pressing need. We think down the road, and we can't. Now, let me ask you this: if you were doing mission work in Africa and you were trying to preach Jesus to those who were hungry and starving, you would know that their ultimate need is Christ. But before you can ever give them Christ, there's a more pressing need that you've got to meet in the right now. And that need is, you got to put food in their belly. If you put food in their belly and you put clothes on their back, you start meeting some of their pressing needs, then you're going to open yourself up to the potential to be able to deal with, you know, your message of evangelism will never drown out the sound of a grumbling belly. You know what I'm saying? So we meet that immediate need. And I promise you, if you preach a good funeral that offers comfort to people in their dark hour, they'll seek you out. They'll seek, you know. I don't know how many times after a funeral's over I've had people come and say, hey, I know I need to give my life to the Lord. I know I need to get my heart right. I'm going to come be in church with you. And a lot of times I've had people follow through with exactly what they said they would do.